In the summer of 1888, I was living with my good friend Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective, in Baker Street. He was so highly intelligent that he never failed to surprise me. One morning in July, he turned to me lazily and said,
"Watson, if I am not wrong, you have been to the post office in Wigmore Street to send a telegram."
He was, of course, quite right, but I had no idea how he could know this. I had told no one. "Very good, Holmes," I replied. "Did you follow me when I went out?"
"No, Watson."
Holmes smiled. "Then perhaps you will explain," I said a little impatiently.
"Elementary, Watson,"
my friend replied.
"There's a little reddish mud on your shoe. Outside the post office in Wigmore Street, men are working on the road. I saw them yesterday. The ground there is red, and it's impossible to enter the post office without stepping in it."
"As you say, Holmes, elementary," I said. "And the telegram?"
"Because we were here together all morning, I knew that you hadn't written a letter. There are stamps and postcards on your desk. So why did you go to the post office and not a post box? To send a telegram, of course."
At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, entered.
"There's a young lady to see you,"
she informed us.
"Miss Mary Morstan."
"Mary Morstan,"
Holmes repeated.
"I don't recognize the name. Please ask her to come in, Mrs. Hudson."
He turned to me.
"Don't go, Doctor. Please stay and listen to the lady's story."
I was happy to do as he said. When Miss Morstan came into the room, she seemed calm, but it was clear that she didn't want to waste any time. She was a young woman, small with fair hair. Her clothes showed good taste, but they weren't expensive. She had a pleasant face and beautiful blue eyes. She looked serious and intelligent, but not, I thought, rich. Holmes invited her to sit down, and as she took her seat, for the first time, she seemed worried. Mrs. Hudson left us, and our visitor began her story.
"Mr. Holmes,"
she said,
"I find myself in a very strange situation. I don't understand it at all."
My friend Sherlock Holmes looked very interested.
"Please, tell us everything,"
he said.
"My father was an officer in the army.
She continued.
He was sent to India, where I was born. 2 years later, my mother died, and I was sent home to Scotland. I lived in a small hotel in Edinburgh until I was 17. In 1878, my father returned from India. He sent me a telegram from London asking me to travel south to meet him. He wrote that he was looking forward to seeing me. I took the train to London, then drove to his hotel. But he wasn't there. They told me that Captain Morstan had gone out the night before and had not returned. I waited all day, but there was no news of him, so I went to the police. The next day, I put an advertisement in all the newspapers, but there was still no news. And since then, I have heard nothing of my father."
"What was the date of his disappearance?"
asked Holmes.
"The 3rd of December, 1878.
She replied.
10 years ago."
"And his luggage?"
Holmes continued.
"It stayed at his hotel. I searched his suitcases, but found only clothes and books and some souvenirs from the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. My father worked as an officer at the British prison there for some years before he retired."
Holmes thought for a moment.
"Did your father have any friends in London?"
he asked.
"Only one. Major Sholto, who was an officer with my father in India. He had retired 6 months before my father and was living in Norwood. I wrote to him, but he wrote back to say that he didn't even know my father was in England.
Very strange,
said Holmes.
There is more.
Miss Morstan went on.
6 years ago, I saw an advertisement in the Times. It asked for my address and informed me that there was good news. There was no name or address. At that time, I had just started working for Mrs. Forrester's family as a governess. I replied to the advertisement, and that same day, I received a small box in the post. In it, I found a very large pearl. There was no message. Since then, every year on the same day, I have received a pearl in the post. They are worth a lot of money, Mr. Holmes, and they're also very beautiful.
As she spoke, she took a flat box from her bag, opened it, and showed us 6 beautiful pearls.
I find your story strangely exciting,
said Holmes.
Do you have anything else to tell us, Miss Morstan?
One more thing.
She replied.
This morning I received this letter. Perhaps you would like to read it.
Yes,
said Holmes.
And can I see the envelope, please?
He studied the envelope carefully.
This was posted in London on the 7th of July, yesterday. There's a man's fingerprint on the envelope, probably the postman's. The paper and envelope are expensive, but there's no address, of course.
He then went on to read the letter aloud.
Come to the Lyceum Theatre this evening at 7 o'clock and wait outside the front door. You can bring 2 friends, but you must not bring the police. I have good news for you. Your unknown friend. What a mystery. So, what's your plan, Miss Morstan?
I don't know.
She replied.
That's why I have come to you, Mr. Holmes. Please, tell me what I should do.
You must go to the Lyceum this evening,
said Holmes.
Dr. Watson and I will come with you. Won't we, Watson?
Of course, I answered. If you think that could be helpful.
Thank you both so much,
said Miss Morstan.
You're very kind. My life in Norwood is quiet, and I have no friends. Shall I come here at 6 o'clock this evening?
Yes,
Holmes replied.
But I have one more question for you, Miss Morstan. Is the writing in the letter the same as the writing of the addresses on the pearl boxes?
Yes,
said Miss Morstan, taking some papers from her bag.
Excellent,
cried Holmes.
Let me see.
The great detective looked carefully at the writing in the letter and the addresses. He seemed very pleased.
They were written by the same hand,
he informed us.
Is it possible that this is your father's writing?
He asked.
No, his writing was quite different,
she told us.
That answer doesn't surprise me,
said Holmes.
We'll see you at 6. Please leave the papers here. Goodbye, Miss Morstan.
The young lady stood up to leave and smiled.
Goodbye, Mr. Holmes. Goodbye, Dr. Watson.
Until this evening, I said, looking into her blue eyes. I heard her go down the stairs and out into Baker Street. From the window, I watched her walk away down the street. A very fine woman, Holmes, I said.
Really?
My friend replied lazily.
I didn't notice. Now, what do you think of this writing?
A businessman's, perhaps, I answered.
I don't think so, Watson,
he replied.
The writer sometimes finds it difficult to decide what to do. I'm going out,
he informed me, standing up.
I need to think some more. I'll be back in an hour.
My friend left me alone in the room. Everywhere I looked, I saw the face of our visitor, Miss Mary Morstan. I waited impatiently for 6 o'clock and her return. dirty passage and came to a big wooden door. The servant opened it, and we looked into a brightly lit room. A small, bald man stood in front of us in the strange yellow light. He was a very ugly little man with bad teeth and thin lips. He looked about 30 years old.
"I am your servant, Miss Morstan,"
he said again and again in his strange, high voice.
"Please come in. My house, I hope, is a special place among these poor streets of South London."
It was true that we were all surprised by the room. While everything in the rest of the house looked old and broken, everything here was expensive and beautiful. The curtains were heavy and lovely to look at, and the carpet was thick under our feet. Everywhere there were valuable paintings and vases. A beautiful lamp burned in the middle of the room and gave out a sweet smell.
"My name is Thaddeus Sholto. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto,"
the man went on. He smiled as he spoke, and he moved his hands, which were held closely together all the time.
"You are Miss Morstan, of course. And these gentlemen?"
This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes,
replied Miss Morstan.
and this is Dr. Watson.
"A doctor!
Cried Sholto in excitement.
Dr. Watson, could you please listen to my heart? I really feel quite ill. I'm a little worried."
I listened to his heart, but I could find no problem with it, although he was shaking with fear. "You seem to be in good health," I informed him. "There's no reason to be worried."
"Thank you, Doctor,"
he said.
"I've worried about my heart for a long time. I'm sorry that your father didn't take more care of his heart, Miss Morstan. With more care, perhaps he would still be alive and with us today."
His careless words made me angry. Miss Morstan's face went very white, and she sat down.
So he's dead?
She said.
I knew it.
"I can tell you everything,
Sholto went on.
and I will tell you everything, although my brother Bartholomew won't be happy. I'm pleased that you've brought your friends with you, because that means there are 4 of us against my brother. But it's very important that no one else knows about this."
Don't worry.
Said Holmes.
I won't tell anyone about this, and I'm sure Dr. Watson and Miss Morstan will say nothing.
We said nothing, but both nodded our heads to show that we agreed.
"Excellent,"
He replied.
"excellent. Would you like a glass of wine, Miss Morstan? No? I hope that it won't trouble you if I smoke. I feel a little nervous."
He lit a cigarette, and we sat down around him on the floor with our legs crossed.
"When I decided to write to you,"
He began.
"I didn't give this address because I feared that you might bring the police with you. That's why I asked my man to meet you at the Lyceum. I told him not to speak to you if he was worried. I don't like the police, you see. I find them very unpleasant. My life here is very quiet. As you can see, I have a strong interest in paintings, and I love beautiful things."
Excuse me, Mr. Sholto,
Said Miss Morstan.
but I am here because I think you can tell me about my father's death. It's late, so please, tell me everything you know.
"We must go to Norwood to see my brother, Bartholomew.
Sholto replied.
He's very cross with me now. We argued last night because he's angry that I wrote to you, Miss Morstan. He's a dangerous man when he's angry, I can tell you."
Perhaps we should go to Norwood now, I said, looking at my watch.
We can't go now.
Sholto laughed loudly.
I must tell you the story first. I'm sure you've realized my father was once Major John Sholto of the Indian Army. 11 years ago, he retired and came to live at Norwood in a house called Pondicherry Lodge. He'd made a lot of money in India and had come back to England with a large number of Indian servants. He bought a big house and enjoyed a good life there. My brother, Bartholomew, and I were his only children. When Captain Morstan disappeared, we read the story in the newspaper. Because we knew that he'd been a friend of our father's, we talked about it with him. Together we wondered what had happened to the captain. We never thought for a moment our father was the one person who knew. After Morstan's story was in the paper, Father was too frightened to go out alone, and he always kept 2 bodyguards with him. We never understood why, but he became terrified of men with wooden legs. Some 8 years ago, he shot a black-haired man with a wooden leg who came to the house. The poor man was from the town nearby and was only trying to sell things that he'd made. Bartholomew and I had to pay him a lot of money to stop him going to the police. Now, at last, we understand why our father acted in this strange way. And I'll tell you the story. Early in 1882, he received a letter from India, which made him very worried. When he opened it at the breakfast table, his face went quite white. We never found out what he had read in the letter, but as he held it in his hand that morning, I could see it was short and that the writing was difficult to read. My father had been sick for many years, but now he became seriously ill. One day, at the end of April, his doctor told us that he was dying. But there was something that he wanted to tell us before he died. My brother and I went into his bedroom. He was lying in bed and breathing heavily. He asked us to lock the door and come to him. Then, in a voice full of pain, he spoke. "There's one thing I must tell you," he said. "I've acted very badly towards Morstan's daughter. I've kept all the treasure for myself and given none of it to the girl. Half of it should be hers, but I'm not a man that likes to give money away to anyone, and I've enjoyed keeping all the treasure here at Pondicherry Lodge. When I'm dead, you must send Miss Morstan her half of the treasure, but not before. I'll tell you how her father died," he went on. "He'd had a weak heart for many years, although he never spoke about it. I was the only person who knew. When we were together in India, we'd acquired the treasure. I'd brought it back to England, and when Morstan arrived, he came to see me to ask for his half. He walked here from the station, but we argued about how we should divide the treasure between us. Morstan became very angry, jumped out of his chair, and suddenly fell to the floor, his face quite grey. He cut his head badly on the treasure chest, and I saw immediately that he was dead. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but I feared they'd think I'd murdered him. Also, I didn't want anyone to find out about the treasure. As Morstan had told me no one knew that he'd come to see me, I decided no one should ever find out. My servant helped me to bury the body, and a few days later I read in the newspapers that Captain Morstan had disappeared. You must understand that I didn't actually kill my friend, although it was wrong of me to hide his body and to keep all the treasure for myself. That's why you must now give Miss Morstan her half of the treasure. The treasure is hidden in... At that moment, his face suddenly changed. His eyes became wild and he looked terrified. "Don't let him in!" he cried. "Please don't let him in!" Bartholomew and I turned to look at the bedroom window. There we saw a terrible hairy face with frightening red eyes, staring into the room from the darkness outside. We ran to the window, but when we got there, the man had disappeared. We returned to our father's bedside, but he was dead. That night, we searched the garden, but we found only a single footprint in the mud under the window. We went to bed with heavy hearts that night. In the morning, we found the window of my father's room open. Someone had searched his cupboards and boxes, and on his chest there was a piece of paper with the words, "The Sign of 4." We never knew who had entered the house that night, and the words meant nothing to us.
The little man stopped to smoke some more and sat in silence for a few minutes. We were all thinking about the story that he had told us. Miss Morstan was, of course, very saddened by the news of her father's death. I offered her a glass of water, which she accepted. Finally, Thaddeus Sholto continued his story.
For weeks and months, my brother Bartholomew and I looked everywhere for the treasure, but without success. We weren't poor, but with the treasure, we would be very rich. That's why I wanted to make sure that you would receive your half, Miss Morstan, as our father wished. Sadly, Bartholomew disagreed, and we argued. I decided to leave Pondicherry Lodge and came to live here. Yesterday, I heard that my brother had found the treasure, and that's why I wrote to you, Miss Morstan. Now, we can drive to Norwood and ask Bartholomew for our part of the treasure. He knows that we're coming, but I must tell you that he isn't happy.
It's late,
said Holmes.
and I think we should go to Norwood now. Our cab is still waiting outside. Thank you for your story, Mr. Sholto. I'm sure this will be an interesting night.
and the driver took us quickly to Norwood. As we travelled, Thaddeus Sholto spoke without stopping in his high voice.
My brother Bartholomew is a clever man,
He began.
He realized the treasure was somewhere indoors, so he measured all the rooms and passages. He discovered there must be a space somewhere at the top of the house, so he made a hole in the ceiling of our father's bedroom. And that's how he found the secret room under the roof where the treasure was hidden. He brought the chest down through the hole and opened it. He thinks it's worth at least £500,000.
Neither Holmes nor I had expected the treasure to be worth so much, and I could see that Miss Morstan was also very surprised. This would make a great difference to her life. I wanted to be happy for her, but my heart felt very heavy. I managed to say that this was excellent news, but then I fell silent, and I heard nothing more that Sholto said. Finally, we arrived at Pondicherry Lodge. The driver got down and opened the door of the cab. It was nearly 11 o'clock. We'd left the fog of the great city behind, and it was now a warm and pleasant night. A light wind blew from the west, and heavy clouds moved slowly across the sky. Thaddeus Sholto took one of the lamps from the cab, and we walked towards the house. Pondicherry Lodge stood in a very large garden. There was a high wall around the house, with broken glass on top. There was only one door in the wall, and this was heavy and made of dark wood. Thaddeus Sholto knocked 3 times.
Who's there?
Asked a deep voice.
Don't you recognize my knock?
Replied Sholto. We heard the sound of a key in the lock, and the door was opened by a short, ugly man with small, grey eyes.
Mr. Thaddeus.
He said.
But who are these people? Mr. Bartholomew said nothing about other people.
I'm surprised,
Said Sholto.
I told my brother last night I'd bring some friends with me.
He told me nothing.
The man said, but he let us in. He closed the door behind us, and we followed a path through the garden, which had no flowers or trees in it, and walked towards Pondicherry Lodge. The house was enormous, but square and very ugly. It was dark and silent.
That's strange,
Said Sholto.
There's no light in my brother's room, although he knows about our visit.
But there's a light in that window by the door, I said.
That's Mrs. Bernstein's room.
Sholto explained.
She's the housekeeper. She'll be able to tell us where my brother is.
At that moment, we all heard the sound of a woman screaming. We looked at Sholto.
That's her,
He said.
Mrs. Bernstein. Wait here.
He ran to the door and knocked 3 times. It was opened by a tall, old woman who was clearly happy to see him.
Mr. Thaddeus,
She cried.
I'm so pleased you're here.
The door closed behind the housekeeper and Thaddeus Sholto. We still had the lamp with us, and Holmes used it to look more closely at the garden.
What are those?
Said Miss Morstan, looking at the holes in the grass.
Mr. Bartholomew Sholto has been digging here for the last 6 years.
Said Holmes.
But when he finally found the treasure, it was in the house, not the garden.
Just then, the door opened and Thaddeus Sholto ran out. He looked very frightened.
Come in!
He cried in his high voice.
There's something wrong with Bartholomew.
We followed him into the housekeeper's room.
Mr. Bartholomew has locked the door to his room,
The old woman explained.
and he refuses to let me in. I've waited all day because he often likes to be alone. But an hour ago, I began to fear something bad had happened. I looked through the keyhole into his room and I saw him. The look on his face was terrible. I can't go back upstairs, Mr. Thaddeus.
Holmes, with the lamp in his hand, went upstairs, and I and Thaddeus Sholto, who was shaking with fear, followed him. The detective stopped several times to look carefully at the stairs. He moved slowly, and we waited patiently behind him. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long passage. There was an enormous Indian painting on one wall, and on the other side of the passage there were 3 doors. The third door was Bartholomew's room. Holmes knocked loudly on it, but there was no answer. Holmes then tried to open the door, but it was locked. He crouched down and looked through the keyhole. Immediately, he stood up again. It was clear that he was very worried.
This is serious, Watson,
he said.
See for yourself.
I crouched down to look through the hole and saw something terrible beyond it. Light from the moon entered the room through the window, and in that light I could see an unmoving face. The face of Thaddeus Sholto, with the strangest, most frightening smile fixed on it. I turned to make sure that Thaddeus Sholto was still with us, and then I realized Bartholomew was Thaddeus's twin brother. "What can we do, Holmes?" I asked.
We must enter the room,
my friend answered, then threw himself against the door. But the lock was a strong one, and the door refused to open. So Holmes and I threw ourselves against it together. And this time it opened. We found ourselves in Bartholomew Sholto's room. It was a small laboratory full of different things in bottles on the table and on the floor around the edges of the room. One of the bottles on the floor was broken, and some smelly black tar was coming out of it. In one corner of the room there was a ladder, and at the top of it there was a hole in the ceiling. At the bottom there was a rope. At the table, on a wooden chair, sat Bartholomew Sholto. We saw at once that he had been dead for some hours. His hand lay on the table next to a sheet of paper. On the paper we read the words, "The Sign of 4." "What can it mean?" I asked.
It means murder,
Holmes replied.
Look at this.
He showed me a long, dark thorn in the dead man's skin, just above the ear.
It's a poison thorn, Watson.
He went on.
You can take it out, but be very careful.
I took the thorn between my finger and my thumb. There was a very small drop of blood on Bartholomew's face where it had entered the skin. Suddenly, I remembered Thaddeus Sholto, who was still standing behind us. He looked terrified. "Are you all right?" I asked.
The treasure has gone!
He cried.
Someone has stolen it! I helped my brother bring it down last night. I was the last person to see him. I left him here, and I heard him lock the door as I went downstairs.
What time was that?
Asked Holmes, suddenly interested.
10 o'clock,
replied Sholto.
And now he's dead. The police will think I killed my brother. I'm sure they will. Mr. Holmes, you don't think that I'm a murderer, do you?
I'm sure you didn't kill your brother,
said the detective.
And I suggest that you go to the police station immediately and tell them what happened. Watson and I will wait here.
At Holmes's words, Sholto became a little calmer.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I'll go now,
he said. And with that, he went down the stairs and left the house. Holmes turned to me.
Watson,
He said,
we have perhaps half an hour. Sit down. I have work to do. First, I'd like to know how the murderer entered and left the room. No one has opened the door since last night. But what about the window?
Holmes crossed the room and looked carefully at the window.
Yes,
He said,
someone has entered the room here. It rained a little last night. And look, Watson. Here's a footprint and a round, muddy mark. And here's another. Very interesting.
That isn't a footprint, Holmes, I said.
No,
He agreed.
it's the mark of a wooden leg.
The man with the wooden leg, I cried. Do you remember? Thaddeus Sholto told us that his father was terrified of men with wooden legs.
Of course.
My friend replied.
But this man with a wooden leg didn't work alone. Could you climb this wall?
I looked out of the open window. The moon shone on the side of the house. Impossible, I said.
Impossible without help.
Answered Holmes.
But with a friend at the window and a rope, you could do it. A man with a wooden leg could do it.
Perhaps, I agreed. But how then did this friend enter the room? The door was locked,
Think, Watson.
said Holmes.
He didn't come through the door, and he didn't come through the window.
I looked around the room and then cried, He came down the ladder from the room under the roof.
Of course.
Holmes agreed.
It's the only possible way that's left. Let's now examine the secret room, Watson.
I followed my friend up the ladder and into the room under the roof. Holmes held up the lamp, and we looked around us. We were in a small, empty room. The roof was high enough for us to stand, but it was a tiny space.
See here, Watson?
Said Holmes.
There's a door which opens onto the roof. This is how our man came into the house.
He put down the lamp, and once again I saw a look of surprise on his face. I soon understood why. On the floor were some little footprints. Holmes, I cried, is it possible that our murderer is a child?
No,
He replied.
not a child.
Then how do you explain those tiny footprints? I asked.
Everything will become clear, Watson. Let's go down.
I could see that he had not slept at all. "Are you all right, Holmes?" I asked. "I heard you moving around your room in the night."
I didn't sleep.
My friend replied.
I spend the night thinking about our problem. I know the men, I know the launch, everything. But I can get no news. The Baker Street boys have searched both sides of the river, but they've found nothing. And Mrs. Smith has no news of her husband. It's a real mystery.
Is it possible that the launch is no longer in the centre of London, but has travelled up the river? I wondered.
I had the same idea,
said Holmes.
Some of the boys are now searching both banks of the river as far up as Richmond. If they find anything, Wiggins will come and tell us.
But the day passed and we did not see Wiggins. Holmes and I read the newspapers, which contained more stories about the death in Norwood. They all reported that Thaddeus Sholto was the probable murderer of his brother Bartholomew, and described Inspector Lestrade as a great detective. In the evening, I took a cab to Camberwell to give the latest news to Miss Morstan. When I returned to Baker Street, my friend was strangely silent. He answered my questions with single words and smoked cigarette after cigarette. I woke early to find him by my bed, dressed as a sailor.
I'm going down the river, Watson,
he said.
I've been thinking about this all night, and it's the only thing to do.
I'll come with you, I offered immediately.
No,
he replied.
You must stay here. We may have news from young Wiggins during the day. Please open any messages or telegrams that arrive and decide what to do if news comes. Will you do that for me, Watson?
Of course, I agreed.
You can't send me a telegram,
he said,
because I don't know where I'll be. But I hope that I won't be away long, and I'm sure I'll have some news when I come back.
I got up hours later. Mrs. Hudson brought me the morning newspaper with my breakfast. On the second page I read, "Strange death in Norwood. The mystery around the death of Mr. Bartholomew Sholto in Norwood, South London, has become deeper. It is now clear that Mr. Sholto was not murdered by his brother Thaddeus, who is now a free man. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard has told this newspaper that he hopes to arrest the real killer in the very near future." Laughing, I threw the paper onto the table, but then saw a small notice at the bottom of the page. I read it interestedly. Lost. Mordecai Smith, boatman, and his son Jim left their house by the river at Millbank, London, in the steam launch Aurora at 3 o'clock last Tuesday morning. Since then, there has been no news of them. Mrs. Smith at Millbank, or at 221B Baker Street, will pay £5 to anyone who can give her information about her husband and his launch. That notice is Holmes's idea, I thought. It was a very long day. I spent it waiting for a knock at the door with news of Mordecai Smith and the Aurora. I tried to read my book, but found it impossible not to think about Miss Morstan and the missing treasure. At 3 o'clock, I finally heard a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson brought Inspector Lestrade into the room.
"Is Mr. Holmes out, sir?"
he asked. "He is," I said. "Please sit down, Inspector. Can I offer you a glass of whisky?"
"That's very kind, Dr. Watson,"
he said, sitting down in an armchair.
"Just a small one, with lots of water. It's a very hot day, and this murder in Norwood is a real mystery."
"So, Mr. Thaddeus isn't his brother's murderer, then?" I said, bringing Lestrade his drink.
"That's right."
Lestrade agreed.
After he left Mr. Bartholomew on the night of his death, he was with someone all the time. He can't be the murderer.
The inspector looked so disappointed I didn't like to remind him about Holmes saying Thaddeus Sholto was not his man.
Your friend, Mr. Holmes, is a wonderful man,
he said suddenly.
He's clever, and he never gives up. He's difficult sometimes, it's true, and he works in strange ways. But he's helped the police several times, and I'm grateful to him for that.
What brings you here, Inspector? I asked, smiling. Lestrade took a paper from his pocket.
I've received a telegram from Mr. Holmes,
he replied. I took the telegram from the inspector and read it quickly. To Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Go to Baker Street immediately. If I am not there, wait for me with Dr. Watson. We hope to find Sholto's killer tonight. Holmes. This is good news, I said.
Of course, it isn't certain that Mr. Holmes will take us to the murderer,
said Lestrade, who had now finished his whisky. His words made me angry, but before I could say anything, we heard someone coming up the stairs very slowly, breathing heavily. An old, white-haired sailor opened the door.
Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes here?
He asked in a dry voice. No, I replied, but I work with Mr. Holmes, so if you have a message for him, you can give it to me. The old sailor stopped to think for a moment.
I have to report my news to Mr. Holmes himself,
he said. Is it about Mordecai Smith's launch, the Aurora?
Yes. I know where the men are, and that treasure too.
Then tell me, I said, and I'll tell Sherlock Holmes when he returns.
No,
the man replied.
I'll only talk to Mr. Holmes himself.
Well, you must wait for him then, I said.
I'm a busy man,
he answered.
I can't wait for anyone.
He turned to leave the room, but Lestrade had stood up and was now at the door.
That's not possible, I'm afraid,
he said.
You have important information and must stay here. Please, sit down.
It's not fair,
said the old sailor with an angry look on his face, but he sat down in an armchair. Lestrade and I sat down at the table. I offered him a cigar, and we continued our conversation. Suddenly, we both heard Holmes's voice in the room with us.
Aren't you going to offer me a cigar too?
We turned in surprise to see Holmes in the armchair where the old sailor had been sitting. Holmes! I cried. But where's the sailor?
Here,
he said, and he pointed to a white wig on the table next to him.
I'm your sailor. I'm very pleased you and the inspector didn't recognize me. I've spent the day as an old man, and a very interesting day, too. I understand Mr. Thaddeus Sholto and his servants are no longer under arrest?
Lestrade nodded sadly.
Don't worry, Inspector,
Holmes went on.
We'll soon have the real criminals. I need a fast police boat, a steam launch, at Westminster at 7 o'clock this evening.
Lestrade agreed immediately.
I'll also need 2 strong police officers, because there will be 2 or 3 men on the Aurora.
Lestrade nodded.
And finally, I'm sure that when we find the treasure, Dr. Watson would like to take it to Miss Morstan, the owner.
Lestrade looked a little worried for a moment.
All right,
he said.
But the police need to see it later.
Of course,
Holmes agreed.
I think we'll have an interesting evening, gentlemen.
Lestrade ate dinner with us. Holmes was now very bright and excited, while Lestrade seemed calmer. When Mrs. Hudson had taken the plates away after our meal, Holmes gave a glass of whisky to Lestrade and another to me.
A drink before we go,
he said.
Watson, please bring your revolver with you. Our adventures tonight may be dangerous.
He looked out of the window.
Our cab's here.
He went on.
Let's go.
We reached Westminster just after 7 o'clock. Our boat was waiting for us. Lestrade, Holmes, and I boarded the launch and sat down at the back. There was a crew of 2 men, and there were also 2 tall police officers on the boat.
Where are we going?
Asked Lestrade.
To the Tower of London.
Holmes replied. Our launch moved quickly away from the riverbank.
Good,
Said Holmes.
Our boat is a fast one. Watson, let me explain why we're here. The Baker Street boys couldn't find the Aurora anywhere on the river, but I knew the boat must be somewhere. Small and his associate were hiding, I was sure, until the time was right for them to leave the country. Suddenly, I realized what they'd done. They'd left the Aurora with a boat builder and had probably asked him to do some small repairs. Dressed as an old sailor, I visited every boat builder on the river. I had no luck at the first 15 builders, but at the 16th, I found the Aurora and Mr. Mordecai Smith himself. He was very drunk and was shouting at the boat builder, "I want her tonight at 8 o'clock and not a moment later. I have 2 gentlemen who won't wait." Smith went back to the pub, and I returned to Baker Street. We'll wait on the river for the Aurora to appear, and when she does, we'll take Small, his associate, and the treasure.
The plan might work, I suppose,
Said Lestrade.
We'll see, Inspector.
Said Holmes, smiling. the empty chest. Holmes laughed, but Lestrade was furious.
What have you done with the treasure, Small?
He cried. Jonathan Small stared back at him.
I've hidden it in a place where you'll never find it,
he replied.
That treasure belongs to me and 3 men who are still in prison in the Andaman Islands. The sign of 4. That's why I threw it into the Thames, so that no one in the Sholto or Morstan family would have it. You'll find the treasure in the same place that you'll find little Tonga and the key.
Why didn't you throw the chest into the river? Why did you take the treasure out?
Asked the inspector. Small looked very pleased with himself.
Because I knew it would be much easier to find one chest at the bottom of the Thames than all the pieces of treasure in 100 different places,
he replied.
That was a very stupid thing to do, Small,
Lestrade told him.
You haven't helped yourself.
Small was now very angry.
The treasure belongs to me and the others,
he repeated.
Not to any Sholto or Morstan. You have no idea of the price we paid to get that treasure, or the pain.
You're right,
Holmes said as he lit a cigarette.
We haven't heard your story, so we don't know how you acquired the treasure. Please tell us.
Small became a little calmer at Holmes's words.
You've been fair to me, sir,
he said.
So, if you want to hear my story, I'll tell you. But there's a lot to tell. Perhaps I could have a drink.
Lestrade nodded, and Holmes gave Small a small glass of whisky. He took a drink and began his story.
I was born in the west of England, and my family were good, honest people. I always brought them a lot of trouble. When I was 18, I joined the army and went to India. But I hadn't been there very long when I went swimming in the river Ganges. I was attacked by a crocodile, and it bit my leg off. I almost died. I spent 5 months in hospital, and when I came out, the army didn't want me anymore. I was miserable for a while, but then a man called Abel White gave me work. It was a good job, and I decided to spend the rest of my life working for him, when suddenly the country was at war. 1 minute everything was calm, and the next minute 200,000 natives were attacking all the white men in India. Night after night, the sky was lit by burning houses on the hilltops. It was a terrible time. Every day we saw white men and their families on their way to Agra, where the nearest soldiers were. But Mr. White refused to leave, and I stayed with him until the day that the natives came for him. They burned his house and murdered him. I found his body half-eaten by wild dogs. Of course, I ran for my life. Late one night, I managed to reach Agra, but the rebels were everywhere. I joined the soldiers who were trying to defend the city, but it was impossible. Finally, we had to hide in the old fort of Agra. It's an enormous place, and we didn't have enough men to defend all the gates. So, we had a group in the middle of the fort, and one white man with 2 or 3 natives at each gate. There were 2 Sikhs with me as their leader at one gate. We'd spent 2 nights together. They were both tall, strong men, Muhammad Singh and Abdullah Khan. They could speak English quite well, but they didn't say much. I stood alone at the gate, looking down on the river and the great city. We heard the rebels all night, and could never forget the danger we were in. The third night was dark and dirty, with heavy rain. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I put down my gun to light a cigarette, and immediately the Sikhs attacked me. They had knives, and I was too terrified to move. "Don't make a noise," said Khan. "If you work with us tonight, you'll receive a quarter of some treasure that we're planning to steal. It will be divided between the 4 of us." "Who is the 4th person?" I asked. "Dost Akbar," he replied. "Now, if you're with us, I will explain." I nodded to show that I agreed. "There's a man in the north of the country who's very rich, although he doesn't have much land. When the trouble in the country started, he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't lose all his treasure. So he packed half of it in a chest and sent it here with one of his servants. This man is disguised as a merchant, and he uses the name Ahmet. He's now in the city of Agra, waiting to enter the fort. He has a companion, Dost Akbar, my cousin, who knows his secret. Dost Akbar will lead him to this gate tonight, and when he arrives, Muhammad Singh and I will kill him. The treasure will be ours. Now, will you help us?" Here in London, a man's life seems important. But in India, at that time, we saw death everywhere. I didn't know Ahmet, but I could see immediately how the treasure would change my life. I agreed to help. It was still raining, and there were heavy brown clouds in the sky. Less than an hour after my conversation with Khan, Ahmet arrived at the gate with Dost Akbar. Dost Akbar was an enormous Sikh with a long black beard, and Ahmet was a small, fat, frightened man. "Please help us," he said. "We've travelled a long way and need a safe place to spend the night." I didn't want to speak to the man for long because I knew he was going to die. "Enter," I said. "These men will show you the way." The 2 Sikhs took him away. But 2 minutes later, Ahmet came running towards me with Dost Akbar close behind. The Sikh was holding an enormous knife. I could see that the little merchant was going to escape. So I threw myself in front of him. He fell, and almost immediately he was dead. Dost Akbar had plunged the knife into his heart. What we did that night was wrong, I know. But you must understand that I had no choice. I had to help them.
Please continue,
said Holmes impatiently. Small went on with his story.
We dug a hole and buried the merchant. Then we opened the chest. There were jewels of every kind, hundreds of them inside. They would be divided among the 4 of us, but for now we had to hide them. We buried the treasure near the merchant's body, and I drew 4 maps and put the sign of the 4 of us on each one. We knew then that we would always be true to each other. Well, I suppose that you gentlemen know what happened next. More British soldiers arrived in the country and drove the rebels back. Agra was taken by the British Army, and we were beginning to hope that we would be able to leave with our treasure. But then we were arrested for the murder of Ahmet. We were all found guilty and sent to prison for life, although nobody knew anything about the treasure. We were sent at first to prison in Madras, but later we were moved to the Andaman Islands. I was the only white prisoner there, so I didn't have a bad life. In the evenings I was even allowed to watch the army officers, Major Sholto and Captain Morstan, play cards with some of the prison officers. I noticed that the army officers always lost, and one night Major Sholto lost a lot of money. I heard him tell Captain Morstan that he was in serious financial trouble and would have to leave the army, and I saw my chance to escape. I told the Major about the jewels and suggested that he and Captain Morstan should have a fifth of the treasure if they would help the four escape. We agreed on a plan, and I gave a map to Sholto and another to Morstan to show where the treasure was hidden. You can probably guess the rest of the story. Sholto tricked us all and returned to England with the treasure. I was furious, but there was nothing that I could do, until several years later, when I saved the life of a native, Tonga, and he helped me to escape from the Andaman Islands. We came to England together, and if I'm not wrong, you know the rest, Mr. Holmes.
We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Lestrade spoke.
Well, Mr. Holmes, you've done well here,
He said.
And now, I must arrest you, Jonathan Small. Sergeant Judd is waiting downstairs with a cab.
Small seemed strangely calm as he was taken away. Holmes and I sat at the table and lit cigarettes. Holmes, I said heavily, the adventure of the Agra treasure may be our last together.
Really?
I've asked Miss Morstan to marry me, I went on, and I'm happy to say that she's accepted.
Yes,
Holmes replied calmly.
I know.
Impossible, I cried. We've told nobody.
Elementary,
Said Holmes.
Let me explain.